How Tracy Austin Broke My Heart is by David Foster Wallace, and it is a book review on Beyond Center Court, My Story by Tracy Austin. At the beginning of this essay or book review, David Foster Wallace gives three reasons why he is interested in the book, and these three reasons are that he's a big tennis fan, number two, that he's a huge Tracy Austin fan and they're rough contemporaries as far as age. And number three, because he's a fan of this genre, the athlete autobiography or the athlete biography. Even though he's ashamed that he's a fan of the genre, he is a fan of the genre. And usually he shamefully buys one of these books, but puts a classic piece of literature over it so he doesn't get judged at the cashier. So for those three reasons, he's interested in the book. But then he says this book may have broken him for number three, and he can't read books like this anymore. And then he gives many examples of really horrible writing, tautologies, where you say something and then you repeat it, but it doesn't add anything. And not only does it not add anything, it's redundant and unnecessary, saying I'm single because I'm not married, and just riddled with cliches. But as he'll say throughout the review, that the bad writing is only incidental to really the real problem with the book. So first of all, he just playfully pokes some fun at the book. But he says the value of the book for him is that, number one, it's breaking his breaking his addiction to these type of books. But the reason we, as Americans, we love athletes, and the reason we buy these books, and now maybe in 2025 we could say, watch all these documentary about these athletes. And he gives 7 reasons why. Number one, he says Americans are obsessed with being the best, and so if someone is quantifiably the champion or the best at a skill or the best at a sport, we want to know about them. So number one, we as Americans have an obsession with being the best. Number two, he says that a plumber or an accountant or most professions, it's not really quantifiable who's a good one or who's a bad one. And even jobs that try to do it, people wonder how really accurate the numbers reflect there. And so he says, number two, sports are quantifiable. There's a clear winner and loser. There's a batting average. There's home runs. There's all sorts of statistics. And I was thinking during this second point of how much more true with the analytics revolution of the past 10 years or so in all the major sports, that it's even more quantifiable, not only in individual player statistics, but how the individual player impacts winning or doesn't impact winning through those statistics. So number one, he says Americans love to know who the best is. And number two, who the best is quantifiably. And number three, he says they're beautiful. And so you watch Michael Jordan or Pete Sampras do something, and to use a contemporary example that Wallace uses, and you see something and then you can point to something and say that is beautiful. They're not only good at the sport, but they're good in a creative, genius way that other people aren't. Number four, he says that why we love athletes and reading about athletes or watching documentaries about athletes is that they are inspiring us, that if they do transcendent things, if they test the limits of what a human can do on a court or a field or a track, then maybe we can do that. And especially if we read their books, then they can give us a tip or a how in that do it. So it's a search for transcendence, and not only to understand how they reach transcendence, but there's a so what. If they reach transcendence, is that were you born with it? Do you have 5 secrets to it? And so it's really, on our part, a search for transcendence. Number 5, he says that it puts profundity in motion and encapsulates vague ideas. So things like power or grace or control, these are virtues that we throw around, but you can really visualize them when you're talking about an athlete. And he says, how can athletes be great? Well, they can harmonize animal and angel. And I think that's a really beautiful way of describing many athletic endeavors. There's a ferocity, but it has to be an under control ferocity. And so if you're too under control without the ferocity, you're probably not great. But if you're all ferocious without control, you're probably not great. And so to be great is to find out how to harmonize ferocity and control. Number 6, he says that the reason we read these books is to know how these athletes got here. Is there a path? Are there steps? And number 7, how does it feel to win and lose? And does it feel like when I win and lose in tiny little ways that nobody notices? They're important in my life, but I'm also realized that no one really outside of my life really cares all that much about my wins and losses. Well, if you're a great athlete and there's 60,000 people cheering or booing, is there a similarity between how they feel and how I feel? And so for those 7 reasons, that's why we watch sports, or that's why we read about sports, or we watch documentaries on sports. But again, he said, even though those 7 things are true, he, after reading this book, he doesn't think he can do it anymore. Then he digresses and gives a backstory, which is this: that he is a teenager in 1977, and he hears about this prodigy out on the West Coast who is just turned 14, and she not only won a match, but won an entire pro tournament. And so then obscure cable channels and magazines, he figures out that Tracy Austin is this absolutely fascinating young girl, and the reason is there's such a mismatch between her appearance and her play. She is a tiny, even for a 14-year-old, she's undersized, and yet there's a ferocity that doesn't match her looks at all that makes it even more interesting how she could be such a genius on the tennis court. And so Wallace is giving us, he had all the reasons to want to like this book. He's been following her now for 2 decades, and so he has had this fascination with her for years now. And what he wanted to know is, how could she be that small and yet that gifted? Where did her genius come from? Then on page 144, he talks about the book again. So the point then about these sports memoirs, market appeal, because top athletes are profound, because they make a certain type of genius as carnally discernible as it ever can get. These ghost-written invitations inside their lives and their skulls are terribly seductive for book buyers. Explicitly or not, the memoirs make a promise to let us penetrate the indefinable mystery of what makes some persons geniuses semi-divine, to share with us the secret, and so both to reveal the difference between us and them, and to erase it a little, that difference, to give us the we want, expect, only one, the master narrative, the key story. And of course, Wallace is writing this 20 years before a podcast boom. And isn't that the seductive thing about YouTube channels and podcast is we think that if someone is a celebrity or a famous author or famous athlete, that listening to them talk about their craft, that we are going to be able to reach some of the heights that they have, and that we will reach that divinity. And so what he's saying is that this book can get us, that this book promises that it can get us out of our normal or miserable or sad little lives, and that we can experience something religious, something like drugs or sex or religion offer, and that is a transcendent, something more beautiful and something beyond just this world. But he says it's really poorly written, so it's hard. But again, that's not the problem. The bad writing isn't the problem. The problem is that it forgets who its audience is. And he says any sophomore in college knows that you have to know your rhetorical situation or your writing situation. You have to know what you know. You have to know the topic. But you always have to know who you're writing to. And if you're writing to your mom or your professor or strangers, then you're going to say what you have to say in a different way. And so this autobiography, Ghost co-written, she acts as if her audience are other tennis players, family, friends. She doesn't write it to you and I, the reader. So it's poorly written, and she forgets who it's to. And he says, you know, what's the problem is? It's not a lack of writing. It's actually the way that she thinks about her life. She has an oversimplified view of life. She has a lame view of life. And so what ends up happening is she can't give us a transcendent view. She can't give us a view of her relationship with a godlike skill, because she can't even write about a human, her own human life, because there's no depth to her. And so because she can't be a human, then of course she can't be transcendent. And he says, you know, the best parts of the book is when she's completely ignorant about what she's revealing. So when she writes about her parents or her parents' friends, people at the club, or what tennis tournaments do, or other tennis players who were adults when she was a child, the only interesting parts of the book is when she's not even smart enough to know that she's saying too much or revealing too much about a creep at the tennis club, or coercive parents, or a tennis tournament paying her over $100,000 illegally, or her partaking in sports hustling. All these things that she shouldn't be telling on herself, and she's not even self-aware enough to know that she's telling on herself. And then Foster Wallace uses a brilliant example that she's not just living in an unreality, that she's living in an anti-reality. And of course, that doesn't just come through with bad writing, but bad writing on top of really bad storytelling. So the only interesting parts are the fact that she is so not self-aware. And he says, you know what the shame is? The shame is she has a terribly interesting life story. She has a really Greek narrative arc, and that is, how can you be such a genius, be so transcendent, and have what most people long for, and you're only 18 years of age, and you've been places, and you've done things, and you've accrued money that most people spend their whole lives searching for, and you've already achieved that by 18. And through injuries and through accidents, by age 21, you've lost it all. And it's been like a death. But the only thing worse than death is living an entire adult life with the death of your career, again, because of injuries and accidents. And so that could be a terribly interesting thing to speak on. How did you get there? How did you rise? And then the fall, and how did you deal with the fall? And he says when she could speak on that subject, there's just nothing there whatsoever. So it could be great, but it just chooses not to be. Page 150, Austen's story could, since the predicament of a dedicated athlete prodigy washed up at 21, differs in nothing more than degree from that of a dedicated CPA and family man dying at 62, it could have been profound. The book could, since having it all at 17 and then losing it all by 21 because of stuff outside your control is just like death, except you have to go on living afterward, have been truly inspirational. And the publisher's flap copy promises just this, and this is a quote. The inspirational story of Tracy Austen's long struggle to find a life beyond championship tennis. But the publisher's flap copy lies, because it turns out that inspirational is being used on the book jacket only in its ad cliche sense, one basically equivalent to heartwarming, or an even triumphant. Like all good ad cliches, it manages to suggest everything and mean nothing. And so the real tragedy of the book is not that it's poorly written or that someone wrote a book on subject matter that's not interesting. The real tragedy of the book is the subject matter is terribly fascinating, but there was no human pulse there to convey that message. And so it lies. It promises divinity, but it doesn't even give us humanity. Page 151. Because forget divine, there's not even a recognizable human being in here. And this isn't just because of chunky prose or truncated structure. The book is inanimate because it communicates no real feeling and so gives us no sense of a conscious person. There's nobody at the other end of the line. So there's no humanity in it. And then he says, this isn't just a problem with this particular book. It really is a problem with all sports journalism. Someone has just missed or made a winning shot, and 3 seconds after the horn sound, the buzzer sounds, the game is complete. Someone has a microphone in their face asking them how they feel, and all they can come up with always are cliches. Great athletes, quoting Wallace here, usually turn out to be stunningly inarticulate about just those qualities and experiences that constitute their fascination. For me, though, the important question is why this is always so bitterly disappointing, and why I keep buying these sports memoirs with expectations that my own experience with the genre should long ago have modified, and why I nearly always feel thwarted and pissed when I finish them. One sort of answer, of course, is that commercial autobiographies like these promise something they cannot deliver. Personal, and real access to an intrinsically public and performative kind of genius. The problem with this answer is that I and the rest of the US book market aren't that stupid. If impossible promises were all there were to it, we'd catch on after a while and it would stop being so profitable for publishers to churn these memoirs out. Maybe what keeps us buying in the face of constant disappointment is some deep compulsion both to experience genius in the concrete and to universalize genius in the abstract. Let me read that last sentence one more time. To experience genius in the concrete and to universalize genius in the abstract. So really what we want out of athletes is not only to be able to do things that we can't do, but be able to explain them. And not only be able to explain them in a way that will make us transcendent. In other words, we want a religious experience out of these athletes. And so we're just asking too much of these biographies, but this one even doesn't meet Wallace's lowest expectation. And so there's a robotic banality of all sports biographies. But he says, you might think that I'm saying that athletes are dumb. And he says, of course, that's not true. There's no way athletes are dumb. Have you seen an NFL playbook? Have you seen the genius of someone making a cross-court shot in tennis? That can't be the answer. So one thing he says is maybe that there is a genius in thoughtlessness, in someone completely unaffected by their surrounding. Maybe people who overthink these things are not able to be good athletes. And so Wallace seems to start to conclude the essay here that you can either have one of two things. You can either have the transcendent ability to do athletic skills, but not the ability to explain it, or you can be like Wallace and have the ability to explain in the greatest detail I've ever seen why we love sports and why we love sports writing and sports interviews and sports biographies and autobiographies, but then you have no ability to do the thing yourself. And so he says, at best, I think, my interpretation is at best you have the option of having one of the two things. But what you can't say is that it's a problem of athletic ignorance. Maybe who's to say, Wallace concludes, who's to say whether it's actually a genius to be able to stand at a free throw line and not overthink it. Maybe cliches when you're finishing a marathon, just one more step at a time, maybe that is its own kind of genius. So we can't say that athletes are dumb. And so to conclude, the final paragraph, this is for me the real mystery. Whether such a person is an idiot or a mystic, or both and or neither. So in Russian writing, Leo Tolstoy always had these in his short stories, the holy fool. You make fun of someone throughout the whole story because they're eccentric and they're weird, and then you get to the final line of the short story and all of a sudden everyone else was wrong and this holy fool was actually right. And so maybe that's what great athletes are like. The only certainty seems to be that such a person does not produce a very good prose memoir. That plain empirical fact may be the best way to explain how Tracy Austin's actual history can be so compelling and important, and her verbal account of that history not even alive. It may also, in starting to address the differences in communicability between thinking and doing, and between doing and being, yield the key to why top athletes' autobiographies are at once so seductive and so disappointing for us readers. As is so often, sop with the truth, there's a cruel paradox involved. It may well be that we spectators, who are not divinely gifted as athletes, are the only ones able truly to see, articulate, and animate the experience of the gift we are denied. And that those who receive and act out the gift of athletic genius must, perforce, be blind and dumb about it. And not because blindness and dumbness are the price of the gift, but because they are its essence. So maybe it's not a choice between the genius of doing versus the genius of explaining. Maybe the lack of explaining is the genius of doing, Wallace guesses.